I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
I have a dream.
To a new generation of Americans.
Hi, I'm Galila, and welcome to the Revolutionary World of American Government Part 1. During the next 2 hours, you're going to be exposed to enough American government concepts to fill, if not sink, the Mayflower. We'll look at the basics of government, the Constitution and where it came from, federalism, civil liberties and rights, and everything else you'll need to build your very own democracy out of a few common household items.
Since you're watching this on DVD, you have the power to choose how you want to enhance your educational experience. Check this out.
You'll always start off from a main menu. Anytime you want to start over, just select Menu on your keypad. That'll bring you back to the main menu. From there, you've got lots of choices. You can view the program straight through, select which lesson you want to view, take a quick review, tune into some helpful info, take The Revolution, our comprehensive final, or learn more about Cerebellum, the creators of this DVD program. You can also hit Previous and Next at any time in the program to jump between major sections without returning to the main menu. What more could you ask for?
Now, with that out of the way, let's kick things off with Part 1, Introduction to Government.
I'm here in Washington, D.C. on the steps of this nation's Capitol building, the welcome mat of American government. That's right, all that legal and democratic magic that you read about in the papers or watch on public affairs channels like C-SPAN, most of it happens right here.
But that doesn't mean it all started here. Before a government can become mighty enough to deserve its own cable channel, it needs some founding principles. And we'd like to help demystify the origin and nature of American government. And what better place to start than at its humble origin?
Section A, the origins of American government.
Way, way, way back, the ancient Greeks had a lot of time on their hands. When they weren't thinking of sneaky ways to fool the Trojans or inventing science, they busied themselves by tossing around some pretty neat ideas about governments. You may have heard of a guy named Aristotle. He was alive around 350 BC. Aristotle came up with a groovy idea called natural law. Aristotle's theory of natural law holds that society should be governed by certain ethical principles.
When we say ethical principles, we're talking about all the things you should or shouldn't do in society. Aristotle figured that it really wasn't right for a government to disrespect its citizens.
So, based on Aristotle's ethical principles, it wasn't right for a government to come in and take over a citizen's land or steal his leaning posts.
Aristotle's concept that governments should respect individual citizens was rather groundbreaking, but it was unfortunate for the citizens that Aristotle's principles didn't top the charts until centuries after their rockin' debut. After the Greeks and Aristotle, things were stagnant in government development for hundreds of years.
But then the 18th century rolled around and things really started hopping. A bunch of Europeans started making waves with some new revolutionary ideas. We call this period in history the Age of Enlightenment. It took place during the 16 and 1700s.
Stop and listen! We will change the natural law!
During this Age of Enlightenment, philosophers and a handful of other smart guys went around encouraging people to seek alternatives to oppressive government. In other words, governments that didn't abide by the natural law Aristotle proposed way back when. In response, heavy thinkers began to argue a new idea called popular consent. Popular consent asserts that people should be able to participate directly in the governing of their own societies.
One of those heavy thinkers we mentioned was John Locke. Locke, along with a fellow named Thomas Hobbes, took the idea of popular consent a step further and developed it into what is known as the social contract theory. The social contract theory compares the relationship between a society and its citizens to parties entering into a contract.
Basically, Locke argued that all individuals are naturally free. Therefore, people give their consent when they become members of a society. And if a society's government breaks this contract by acting improperly, then the people have the right to revolt. In fact, Locke and Hobbes said that not only do citizens have a right to revolt, they also have a duty to revolt. Pretty radical, huh?
So the social contract theory held that people formed governments to preserve life, liberty, property, and to assure justice. If a government decides to interfere with this, say by laying claim to your CD collection without due process, the contract is broken, and the government no longer has the consent of the people.
And if a population rebels and breaks its contract with an ill-behaved government, they have the right to start a new, kinder, gentler government. And that's pretty much what happened here in America.
Section B, Types of Government.
After the Revolutionary War and before this great big building was built, the Founding Fathers all got together to discuss what type of government to establish. They considered 4 types altogether: the monarchy, the oligarchy, the aristocracy, and the democracy. Now, you probably already know which one they picked, but it's also important to know which ones they didn't.
A monarchy is a form of government in which hereditary rulers, that's people who share the same bloodline, better known as kings and queens, wield absolute power over everybody. If a king or a queen has absolute power, it means they can do pretty much whatever they want.
All the land to the west of the hills shall be yours.
But, darling, I plan to use all the land to the west for my cricket matches.
Oh. Off with his head.
Since the founders knew that monarchy didn't really fly in the American colonies, what with the King of England being an old wet blanket, other forms of government were carefully considered.
There was the oligarchy. An oligarchy is made up of a body of individuals possessing high levels of wealth, social or military status, or achievement. These elite guys and gals pretty much rule everything and everyone. And there was a third form of government called aristocracy. Aristocracy is ruled by a privileged few.
Now, as nice as monarchies, oligarchies, and aristocracies sound, part of the whole reason the descendants of the Founding Fathers left Europe in the first place was to avoid government structures that left little or no popular consent to the people. So they decided to set up a fourth type of government known as democracy.
A democracy is a form of government in which people hold the power to rule themselves. There are 2 main types of democracy. There's direct democracy and indirect democracy.
In a direct democracy, the people all get together and have an equal say in the laws they create. So, in a direct democracy, majority rules, kind of like when people get together to have a town meeting and vote on whether to build a playground or a nuclear power plant.
In an indirect democracy, which is also known as representative democracy, people vote for representatives who work on their behalf to create laws. In an indirect democracy, each citizen gets 1 vote. Once chosen, these representatives then vote within a government structure in order to make and pass laws. This is a 2-step version of democracy.
The Founding Fathers of our country decided to go with an indirect democracy. After all, they figured that at some point in time, America would become a really, really big nation. And if that happened, there'd be no way they could possibly get everyone together in order to facilitate direct rule.
Section C, Characteristics of the American Democracy.
A key idea in American democracy is balance. The delicate balance between many opposing ideas is a theme you'll run into throughout your study of American government.
How did the Founding Fathers achieve that balance, and on their first government, no less? Hi, I'm Jim Lauper, attorney at Democratic Law. Well, there are 6 key components to American democracy, and they're all closely tied to the social contract theory and natural law that we discussed earlier.
The 6 main components of American democracy are popular consent, popular sovereignty, majority rule, individualism, equality, and personal liberty. We'll look at each in turn.
Popular consent is the belief that a government exists only with the consent of the governed, that is, the people. It's a big part of the social contract theory we discussed earlier. With popular consent, government leaders do not get the right to govern from God, from their economic standing, or from their family lineage. They get the right to govern from their governed, the people.
Popular sovereignty is the right a majority of a society has to govern itself. A society determines its destiny by majority vote.
So if a majority of the citizens vote that they want to institute a National Firefighter Appreciation Day, then everyone will get the day off to take a fireman to lunch.
The concept of popular sovereignty is a lot like the next component, majority rule. Majority rule maintains that only the policies supported by a majority of voters shall become law.
Next, individualism maintains that citizens have certain rights that a government isn't allowed to take away. They're called inalienable rights, and they include things like life, liberty, and property. For instance, in America, you have the right to practice whatever religion you believe in. The government didn't give you that right. You were born with it, if you were born in the U.S. of A. In America, it's the government's responsibility to protect that right, and they cannot take it away.
Next, equality holds that all members of a democracy wield equal power.
All qualified citizens get one vote, and one vote only, in American elections.
And finally, personal liberty is freedom from undue governmental interference, including the concept of discrimination, which we'll get to later on in this program.
In America, the government shouldn't tell you where you should live or with whom you should live. That's your own business, and that's personal liberty.
So those are the 6 main components of American democracy: popular consent, popular sovereignty, majority rule, individualism, equality, and personal liberty. Know them, love them, say them in your sleep.
In this section, we gave you a good look at where the ideas for our government came from. Springing from the brains of Aristotle was natural law, which the Enlightenment team from Hobbes and Locke took and expanded into the social contract theory.
With those concepts in hand, the Founding Fathers considered 4 different types of governments: monarchy, rule by kings and queens; oligarchy, rule based on status; aristocracy, rule by an elite few; and democracy, in which the power is in the hands of the people. There are 2 types of democracy: direct, where the people make the laws themselves, and indirect, where the people choose representatives to work on their behalf.
And finally, the 6 main characteristics of a democracy are popular consent, popular sovereignty, majority rule, individualism, equality, and personal liberty.
Part 2, all the stuff that happened before the Constitution was written.
Permanent English settlers first came to America in the early 17th century, 1607 to be exact, in Jamestown, Virginia.
Settlers came to America for a lot of different reasons. Some came to flee religious persecution. Some came because there was an abundance of land to be had. And still others came to enjoy the convenience of 24-hour banking. Whatever the reason, America eventually became the most popular hangout in the world. And soon it was clear that a new nation was born.
Section A, Origins of a New Nation. The relationship between the American colonies and the English crown between the 1620s and mid-1700s played a big part in the birth of the American government. Those early years would greatly affect the decisions the Founding Fathers would eventually make regarding the structure of the American government.
After all those folks came over to what was then the New World, the colonies of settlers and the Crown formed a basic agreement. The Crown determined that it was allowed to regulate trade and conduct international affairs, and the colonies were given the right to govern many of their own domestic affairs, including the power to levy their own taxes. The colonies even got to use the family car, but only on the weekends.
The relationship between the Crown and the colonies worked pretty well until the 1760s.
By that time, England had just sunk a whole lot of money into the French and Indian War as they tried to keep their hold over the New World. When the war ended in 1760 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, England was left monetarily drained. England turned to the colonies to try and recoup some of its losses and raise money by tightening its hold on the colonies. After all, the money had been spent on the protection of the colonies. England first restricted the westward expansion of the colonies and then passed 3 tough laws, which back then were called acts: the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, and the Quartering Act of 1765. Here's a look at each act.
The Sugar Act of 1764 placed taxes on sugar, coffee, and other products that were exported to the colonies. This raised the prices of goods that colonists got from England.
The Stamp Act required all colonists to purchase things called stamps for all documents, including mail, contracts, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards.
And the Quartering Act of 1765 required colonists to house British soldiers in their own homes.
The Stamp Act Congress, held in 1765, was the first official meeting between the colonists. At this first meeting, they discussed the need to take a first step toward colonial unification against England. All the colonies got together and agreed to team up against the English crown should they attack.
The Stamp Act Congress was followed by the Committees of Correspondence, originally organized in Boston and other Massachusetts towns. The Committees of Correspondence eventually spread throughout the colonies, passing colonists information they needed about the British. This intelligence helped turn public opinion against the English.
And then the ball got rolling, and the colonists got together yet again at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, September 5th, 1774. 56 delegates attended, representing every colony but Georgia. At the time, the colonists didn't want to do anything radical, just discuss a few issues with the king.
The delegates of the Continental Congress put their demands together on a document called The Stupid List of Stupid Reasons That Stupid England is Stupid. After much deliberation and market research, the name of this document was changed to the Declaration of Rights and Resolves. The Declaration of Rights and Resolves called for certain colonial rights.
The people demand the rights of petition and assembly. The people demand the right to trial by peers. The people demand freedom from a standing army. The people demand the right to elect representatives who will levy taxes.
The English monarch, King George, read the declaration and pretty much said,
"Nuts to this."
So the colonists reconvened in May of 1775 at the Second Continental Congress.
At that point, it was pretty much a done deal, as fighting had broken out in the Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord, with what Ralph Waldo Emerson called the shot heard round the world.
In spite of this, the colonists made one last-ditch effort at peace, drafting the Olive Branch Petition, though it wasn't actually printed on an olive branch or signed by anyone.
My petition?
Still, the colonists thought it was a pretty nice gesture, but when King George saw it, he pretty much said,
"Nuts to this."
And then he sent 20,000 troops over, just for fun. With all those troops sitting around, the colonists got pretty annoyed. Eventually, the American Revolution broke out because the king was unresponsive to the colonists' demands.
As the war raged on, the colonists got more assertive. They wanted their freedom from the crown and were willing to put up a fight. We'll see how in
Section B, two important documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation.
The Declaration of Independence is one of the most important documents in our history. It currently makes its home at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The Declaration of Independence did just what its title states, declared the colonists' independence from England. It's not a very creative title, but it still served its purpose.
On July 9, 1776, the colonists presented the Declaration of Independence, which had been drafted mainly by Thomas Jefferson. The preamble to the Declaration contained many of John Locke's ideas and went a little something like this.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So basically, the Declaration of Independence said sayonara to the English crown and outlined the principles for a new government.
The preamble continued,
Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to abolish it.
After the preamble, the Declaration went on to list all the things England had done to anger the colonists, mostly violations of personal rights. These rights would later be guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about in Part 2 of this program.
Once the Declaration of Independence was in the can, the colonists went to work on that other important document we mentioned, the Articles of Confederation.
The Articles of Confederation was written in 1776 before the Revolutionary War and was ratified in 1781 after the Revolutionary War. Essentially, the Articles created a league of friendship among the states who, aside from banding together in the war against England, had remained mostly independent. The Articles of Confederation created the type of government known as a confederation. This government gets its power from the states. Basically, it's a league of semi-sovereign states.
The Articles of Confederation was the colonists' first attempt at a unified national government. At the time, few colonists thought of themselves as Americans. They were fiercely loyal to their states and had some problems taking a national government seriously.
Pardon me, sir, but this is where the Continental Congress is meeting.
Yeah, that's a good one, Wig Boy.
In a confederation, the states held most of the power, not the national government. And once the Revolutionary War was over, there wasn't much left to unify the states, and the government collapsed. With no power to tax and no way to regulate trade between the states, there wasn't much the government could do to assert its control on a national level. In fact, the national government was so wimpy that at one point it often forgot Congress was driven out of Philadelphia by its own unpaid army.
You may have wondered just why everyone tended to want such an oddly fashioned, yellow-bellied, limp fish government. Well, think about it historically. The states were afraid to give too much control to one central government for fear that America would turn into another England. In the states' eyes, one central government with lots of power resulted in oppression.
So, the states made their own treaties with other nations. There was no national army, and the budding young country was facing organizational chaos.
That's when the then nearly powerless Congress stepped in and passed a resolution calling for a constitutional convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. And believe it or not, it sounded like a good idea to a fair amount of the states.
Section C, the Constitutional Convention.
Delegates representing the states met back in Philadelphia once again in May of 1787, with everyone but Rhode Island choosing to attend. They came up with two different blueprints for a new government, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan.
The Virginia Plan called for a strong national government that derived its power from the people, not from the states. The New Jersey Plan, on the other hand, called for a loose confederation of states that would share power with a national government. Eventually, the Virginia Plan triumphed.
One of the biggest hang-ups at the Constitutional Convention revolved around representation in Congress. Remember, the origin of Congress stems from indirect democracy. It was time to figure out how to make representation for each state fair. The large states wanted more power because they represented a larger population of citizens. The small states wanted to make sure they didn't get steamrolled just because they were small. To solve this problem, the delegates came up with the Great Compromise.
The Great Compromise basically established Congress as we know it today. The deal was that each state, no matter what size, would be represented in two ways in Congress. In order to do this, a two-part Congress was formed. The Congress would have two parts called houses. You may know them as the Senate and the House of Representatives.
In the Senate, each state, no matter what its size, gets 2 representatives. This equal representation in the Senate made the small states happy. On the other hand, members of the House of Representatives would be determined by state population. This made the big states happy. The more people in a state, the greater the number of representatives in the House.
Unfortunately, great as it was, the Great Compromise led to a whole other can of worms. The states couldn't agree on how to determine their populations. Even though slaves were not allowed to vote, southern states wanted them to be counted because it would give them more representation in the House of Representatives.
That pretty much wraps up our look at America in its pre-Constitution years. Before we go on, let's take a quick look back.
So, things were cool between the colonies and England until the 1760s. Then, after the French and Indian War, England, looking to recoup monetary losses, enforced various acts upon the colonists. These acts got the colonists pretty annoyed. The annoyance grew to rebellion, and the colonists began rallying together against England. They wrote the Declaration of Rights and Resolves, asking for rights that had been taken from them by the Crown. And eventually, the Revolutionary War broke out.
During the war came the Declaration of Independence, largely drafted by Thomas Jefferson and orally presented on July 9, 1776. After the war, the Articles of Confederation were ratified. They called for a Confederate government where states held most of the power. But some thought states were given too much power. So a constitutional convention was held in order to form another kind of government. Delegates of the represented states agreed on the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise called for a two-part Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Part 3, the United States Constitution.
The United States Constitution is neighbor to the Declaration of Independence here in the National Archives. A constitution works like an owner's manual for a government. It's a document or set of documents in which the laws or principles of a government, state, or society are laid out. On our tour of the Constitution, we'll start with the basic principles of the Constitution, look at the articles it contains, and see then how the heck it got ratified or approved by the states. First up,
Section A, the basic principles of the Constitution.
In this section, we'll cover the general ideas that shape the U.S. Constitution.
One of the main questions facing the Founding Fathers was what type of government to set up. They had just had a bad experience with the Confederacy. which concentrated power in the states with a weak central government, and they were still smarting from the unfairness of the unitary system they had dealt with in England. What the Founding Fathers came up with was a system of government called federalism, which is sort of a combination of the two. Federalism calls for a strong national government, but still leaves some power in the hands of individual states.
And so the states were bound together under a strong national government, but still had some specific powers reserved just for them. Including, but not limited to, choosing their own license plate slogans. We'll talk about federalism in a minute. Sunshine State. That's crazy for idiots.
So, the framers of the Constitution created a stronger national government than had been done with the Articles of Confederation. At the same time, they protected the interests of the states. A big concern the framers had was of putting way too much power in the hands of one individual or one branch of the government. To address this concern, they decided to separate the powers. Separation of powers divides government power between three federal branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. The Constitution guarantees that each branch is interdependent upon the other branches via checks and balances. This system of checks and balances gives each branch of government a little bit of control over the others, which allows them to check up on each other. That way, one branch is not allowed to monopolize power.
But there's one more concept to rope into this here caravan of constitutional principles, and that's the Supremacy Clause.
The Supremacy Clause lets everyone know who's in charge. The Supremacy Clause holds that the laws of the Constitution and the nation as a whole are supreme in regard to the laws enacted by each state.
The Supremacy Clause means that any legitimate use of power by the federal government takes precedence over any conflicting actions on the state level. For example, if the federal government's judicial branch finds a law in a state unjust and ridiculous,
the state of Maine outlaws the consumption of any food other than lobster and saltwater taffy.
the state has to nix that law. That's because the judicial branch is responsible for enforcing and interpreting laws through a court system. So, on the legal highway, federal laws have the right of way.
Section B, the Articles of the Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States contains 7 articles, and by articles we don't mean Air Force builds bomber or tragedy strikes local rodeo. Article is just a fancy word for section. We'll concentrate more heavily on the first 3 articles because they set up the 3 branches of our government.
Article 1 establishes the legislative branch of the American government. In other words, it created Congress.
Congress is what's called a bicameral legislature. A bicameral legislature is divided into 2 parts. In this case, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The legislature is responsible for making and passing laws.
England's Parliament, with its House of Commons and House of Lords, is another example of a bicameral legislature.
Article 1 gives us the nuts and bolts of the Congress, like who's qualified to serve in the Senate and the House, the length of their terms, how senators and representatives are selected, and how we know the number of reps each state is entitled to.
Another key to the first article is the list of enumerated powers. This list contains 17 powers that the framers really wanted Congress to have. Sadly, the members of Congress didn't get the powers they really wanted, like super strength and X-ray vision, and had to settle for enumerated powers, like the powers to tax, coin money, regulate commerce, and provide for the national defense.
The framers also threw in the Necessary and Proper Clause, also called the Elastic Clause. This clause is the mother of elastic powers. The elastic powers set forth by the Elastic Clause grant Congress with the authority to pass all laws necessary and proper for carrying out the 17 enumerated powers. So, elastic powers stretch Congress's enumerated powers.
The next article, Article 2, establishes another branch of government, the executive branch. It's called that because it has the power to execute the laws of the nation. And who has the power to execute the laws around this here land? The biggest Mac Daddy of them all. The head honcho, the top dog, the big cheese, El Presidente, the President of the United States.
Article 2 spells out the president's term of office and describes the necessary qualifications for the presidential office. It describes what the job actually is and spells out the rules for replacing the president should the president screw up or die.
Article 3 sets forth the description and structure of the judicial branch. For without Article 3, we would have no judicial branch. And without the judicial branch, we would have no Supreme Court. And if we didn't have the Supreme Court, law and order would become a thing of the past, and we'd all be forced into little cells and listen to nothing but Bananarama songs.
Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution establishes the judicial branch of our government. We also call this the federal court system, which includes the Supreme Court. Article 3 also defines the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. The Supreme Court was given the authority and jurisdiction to decide all cases that were considered on the federal level. This includes cases between states or between a state and federal government.
The creation of this judicial system worried some. You see, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. They have final say on lots of important issues. With this in mind, the Congress also set up inferior courts, federal courts lower than the Supreme Court, and the states set up their own court systems in keeping with the theme of federalism. But even with these small court systems operating, the country still recognized the Supreme Court as an extremely influential part of the judicial system.
After those first three articles, this fourth one is going to seem kind of boring.
Article 4 defines the relationship between the states and federal government and explains how new states are admitted to the Union. Article 5 tells us how to amend the Constitution.
An amendment is a change. Now, the framers didn't want to make it too easy to change the Constitution. I mean, after all, anything too easy to change wouldn't hold much water. That's why they went with a two-stage amendment process.
The two stages of the Constitution's amendment process are proposal and ratification. Proposals are like, hey, why don't we make such and such a change to the Constitution? Ratification is like, hey, that's a great idea, let's go ahead and make that change. Each stage can occur in two different ways. Let's start with the proposal process. Amendments to the Constitution can be proposed two ways. First, there can be a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. Or second, 2/3 of the state legislatures can vote to have Congress call for a National Amendment Proposal Convention.
That second proposal method has never been used, but it's nice to have around because it can be pulled out to whip Congress into action should they not take it upon themselves to propose a constitutional change.
The second half of the two-stage amendment process is ratification. There are two ways ratification occurs. Both ways rest squarely on the shoulders of the states.
The first way constitutional amendments are ratified or approved is by a favorable vote in 3/4 of all state legislatures. The second way is for each state to call a special ratifying convention. If 3/4 of all these state conventions vote in favor of the amendment, then the amendment is in.
It's important to remember that in the 200-year history of the United States, the Constitution has only been amended 27 times, which tells you how good a job the Founding Fathers did when they wrote this stuff in the first place.
Of all the amendments, only one has been repealed or overturned.
Things were looking up. Legal beer was back.
The 18th Amendment, which outlawed the consumption and sale of alcoholic beverages, was ratified in 1919. After a few years, the country decided that prohibition just didn't work.
Beer was back after 13 years, a long time between drinks.
But the only way to repeal an amendment to the Constitution is with another amendment to the Constitution. The 21st Amendment, which made alcohol legal again, was ratified in 1933. So now we have two amendments that just cancel each other out.
And now it's time for Article 6.
Article 6 contains that supremacy clause we told you about earlier. Remember, the Supremacy Clause says the federal government gets the final say in most arguments about laws between it and the states. Article 6 also states that no religious test will be required to hold office.
Article 6 ensures that church and state are kept separate.
Finally, Article 7 contains the directions for how to ratify the Constitution. Ratification is when the document first becomes legal and binding. A vote of 9 of the original 13 colonies is all it took to put ratification into action. So that's the meat of the Constitution for you. Before we go further, let's take a quick look at the articles we just covered.
Article 1 establishes the legislative branch. It created a bicameral legislature called Congress with 2 houses. The article also gives a bunch of rules that apply to this branch of government. Article 2 establishes the executive branch and all the rules that apply to it. Article 3 establishes the judicial branch and the rules applying to it.
Article 4 defines the relationship between the state and the federal governments, and Article 5 tells us how to change the Constitution. Article 6 states the Supremacy Clause and explains how the federal government gets the final say in most arguments about laws. Finally, Article 7 contains the directions for ratifying the Constitution.
Section C, the drive for ratification.
Once the Constitution was penned, ratification was not automatic. The colonies quickly divided into two separate factions, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists favored a strong national government, the growth of industry, and they supported the newly written Constitution.
But the Anti-Federalists preferred stronger state governments, a weaker national government, the continuance of an agrarian economy instead of an industrial economy, and they really weren't big fans of the Constitution.
Not too hard to decode, right? The Federalists wanted a strong federal government, the Anti-Federalists didn't. It was the same argument. In general, the Federalists were made up of merchants from the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and people who owned a lot of land. If you needed a word to describe the Federalists, you'd probably call them elitist.
The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were small farmers, shopkeepers, and working Joes. They believed in the good of the common man and were in favor of a more participatory democracy. In other words, they wanted the government to be more accountable to the people, and they wanted to see more protections of individual rights, something they feared a strong national government couldn't give them.
Unfortunately for the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists brought out the big guns. James the Mad Dog Madison, Alexander the Ham Hamilton, and John Jam Jam Jay. And these big guns proceeded to write some documents called the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a series of 85 political papers that explained the rationale behind the new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists volleyed back with a series of letters that attempted a line-by-line critique of the Constitution.
Unfortunately for the Anti-Federalists, two of the three guys who wrote the Federalist Papers wound up on dollar bills. Now, when was the last time you heard about an Anti-Federalist?
After a feud that would make Shakespeare proud, even though he is English, the Federalists triumphed, and the Constitution was eventually ratified by a final vote by the states, though the Anti-Federalists didn't go home entirely unhappy.
One of the main goals of the Anti-Federalists was to protect personal liberties. They still felt the wounds that England had inflicted on their personal liberties, such as the right to a fair trial. The Anti-Federalists convinced almost everyone else that personal liberties were a good idea. And so, before the Constitution could be ratified, the Bill of Rights was written and became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution.
Here's a quick rundown of the amendments that make up the Bill of Rights. We'll only touch on them briefly now, because we'll be discussing some of these amendments in much more detail later on in the program.
The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech, press, and assembly.
The Second Amendment gives citizens the right to bear arms.
The Third Amendment prohibits the quartering of troops in private homes.
The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizures.
The Fifth Amendment protects the rights of people accused of a crime. It guarantees due process of law, requires an indictment by a grand jury, prohibits a person from being tried for the same crime twice, and gives the defendants in a trial the right not to testify against themselves. The Sixth Amendment continues the rights of people accused of a crime, promising a speedy and public trial before an impartial jury, the right to an attorney, and the right to cross-examine witnesses.
The Seventh Amendment preserves the right to a trial by a jury in a civil suit.
The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment.
The Ninth Amendment states that just because a right is not listed in the Constitution, that doesn't mean the people do not have that right. So all rights not expressly written in the Constitution belong to the people.
The 10th Amendment was designed to make the states happy. It says that any rights that aren't denied to the people or states or specifically given to the federal government are retained by the states or the people. This amendment was added to appease anti-federalists who thought the Constitution ignored states' rights.
Well, with the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists playing such a large role in the ratification of the Constitution, you may wonder what happened after the new government got on its feet. Well, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists didn't go away, but through the years they did kind of morph into the many sides of the following discussion.
Part 4. Federalism.
Section A. The Roots of Federalism.
You remember that when the framers set up the government, they had two main systems to choose from, a unitary system and a government of confederacy.
Now, what the framers eventually designed was a cross between a unitary system and a confederate government. The federal system was like a hybrid. The Constitution bound the states together by a national government that wasn't entirely unitary or entirely confederated. This new form of government was called federalism. Its main component is the division of power between the states and the national government. The key to this new kind of federal system is that instead of the state and national governments deriving authority from each other, each gets its power directly from the people.
Alexander Hamilton, one of the big guns of federalism, offered three major arguments in support of federalism.
Now first, I feel a federal system would prevent tyranny by the government. Second, it would allow for increased political participation by the people. And third, in the form of the states, it would create a testing ground for new policies and programs.
People thought about it and figured Hamilton was right. So the framers ended up forming a federal government with the writing of the Constitution. But you already knew that.
Section B, the powers of government in a federal system.
There are three main types of power under a federal system of government: national powers, state powers, and concurrent powers. Let's start with national powers.
National powers are the powers of the national government. They can be broken down into two types: enumerated powers and implied powers.
Enumerated powers are the powers that the Constitution specifically grants to the federal government. They're the penned powers. They were written down in the Constitution.
Implied powers aren't mentioned in the Constitution, but they are linked to the elastic clause we mentioned earlier.
The elastic clause, which is also called the necessary and proper clause, gives the legislative branch a particularly neat power. Congress has the authority to make any laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its enumerated powers. These elastic powers expand enumerated powers so that Congress can actually get things done.
So, powers that aren't enumerated but are born out of the elastic clause are called implied powers. Tattoo that on your forehead and listen to this example.
Among the enumerated powers of Congress are the powers to tax and spend, issue currency, and borrow funds. Using the necessary and proper clause, Congress decided that it was within the implied powers of the government to establish a national bank. So the enumerated powers of issuing currency and borrowing funds was stretched enough to allow the Congress to establish a bank and give out toasters to all new colonist members.
Aside from levying taxes, issuing currency, and borrowing funds, other national powers include providing an army, conducting foreign relations, and declaring war.
The second type of powers found within the federal government are state powers. State powers are powers held by the states. They include the ability to establish local governments, regulate commerce within the state, and set the timing and method of state and local elections.
Remember the 10th Amendment? States love the 10th Amendment. Why? Because it sticks up for them and doesn't let the federal government push them around. How?
Again, the 10th Amendment says that any powers in the Constitution not given to the federal government are reserved for the states and the people.
Another key to state powers is in Article 4 of the Constitution, which says that each state must give full faith and credit to laws of other states. This basically means that states can't bully one another or try to ignore the laws of another state.
The third type of powers found within the federal system are concurrent powers. Concurrent powers are shared by the state and federal governments. They include the powers to tax, establish courts, and make and enforce laws.
And while those are the three types of powers found in the federal system, there are a couple powers that are denied to both the national and state governments.
These powers, aptly labeled denied powers, come in two forms: bills of attainder and ex post facto laws.
A bill of attainder is a law that makes something illegal without allowing a trial. This kind of law cannot be held by either the federal or state governments. This is exactly the kind of power the Constitution protects against. So, a bill of attainder is like a law on a game board. Go directly to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200.
Ex post facto essentially means after the fact. Ex post facto laws declare an act a crime even if the act was legal at the time it was committed. So, ex post facto laws are a lot like the fashion faux pas of the early 70s. No person can be held accountable or be punished today for the wearing of bell-bottoms and platform shoes when it was cool during the 70s.
Time for a quick review. Remember, there are three main types of powers the government is granted: national powers, including enumerated and implied powers, state powers, and concurrent or shared powers. And don't forget that federalism denies government the power to make bills of attainder and ex post facto laws.
Section C, the evolution and development of federalism.
Just like you went through many stages as you grew up, federalism went through its own stages of development to emerge as the brand of federalism that we have today. In this section, we're going to trace federalism's evolution over 7 distinct periods.
Federalism stages of development go in this order: nationalization, dual federalism part 1, dual federalism part 2, cooperative federalism, creative federalism, new federalism, and competitive federalism. We'll go over each of these periods and place them on a nifty historical timeline to help you follow along. So let's open up the gates of history and meet nationalization.
Nationalization starts off our timeline. The first stage of federalism took place during the years between 1789 and 1830. See?
Okay, so why nationalization? What is it and what makes it a stage in the evolution of federalism? First things first, think about the word national. Nation, all. You should remember that one of the three types of powers within the federal structure are called national powers.
Hence, nationalization was a period that marked the expansion of national powers, or the power of the central federal government.
This growth of national power was brought about via some pretty important decisions made by the Supreme Court during this period.
In particular, a lot of this nationalization stuff can be attributed to a fellow named Chief Justice John Marshall. He put judicial review into the job description of the Supreme Court. Marshall was Chief Justice during this period of nationalization, along with being a Federalist.
Therefore, the Marshall Court set out to strengthen the central federal government with the legal decisions they made. The Marshall Court also promoted another big principle based on enumerated powers. Remember, enumerated powers were specifically drawn up and put into the Constitution. These are the powers someone actually bothered to write down somewhere.
The Marshall Court's big influence came when it was needed to interpret several enumerated powers within the Constitution. The court, marked by the desire to expand the powers of the national government, ended up doing just that by broadly interpreting the powers of Congress set forth in the Constitution.
With the 1819 case of McCulloch versus Maryland, the Marshall Court decided in favor of national authority. The case was about the Second Bank of the United States, which refused to pay taxes to the state of Maryland. The bank argued that since it was a federal institution, it shouldn't be taxed by the states. But Maryland, in turn, said that it was unconstitutional for the federal government to make its own banks. Well, the Marshall Court decided that, based on the Congress's enumerated powers to issue currency and levy taxes, they also had the power to form banks, and they could protect these banks from being taxed. This very broad interpretation of enumerated powers resulted in a whopper of increase in federal power.
So that's nationalization, a time of federalism marked by an increase in the power of federal government. Next up, dual federalism.
Contrary to popular beliefs, this stage doesn't involve any medieval armor or swords, but fittingly, it does include a war.
Dual federalism is actually broken down into two different periods: dual federalism part 1 and dual federalism part 2. Let's see where they fall on the timeline.
Part 1 takes place during the 1830s up until the early 1860s. Part 2 takes place during the 1860s up until the early 1930s. Now let's get the details.
Dual federalism came about after Chief Justice Marshall's departure from the Supreme Court. Marshall was replaced by new Chief Justice Roger B. Taney.
It was the Taney Court that decided that after years of growth of federal power, it was time to settle down. The Taney Court basically felt that the federal government had grown big enough, and it was time for a return to the original concept built into the system of federalism, the concept of concurrent power. Remember, concurrent powers are powers that are shared by both the state and federal governments.
Taney's court decided that the best way to handle things was to ensure that the federal government and the state governments have clearly outlined in separate domains of power.
Because of this, dual federalism has been compared to a layer cake where the roles of each level of government are clearly defined. Chocolate on top, vanilla on the bottom, federal on top, state on the bottom. During the second half of dual federalism, state powers were indeed increased, but they still weren't exactly equal to the federal government.
Now recall that dual federalism is broken up into two stages. Why? Simple. War. The Civil War, that is.
You see, while the Taney Court was doing its best to increase state rights and independence, one very important doctrine or principle of law was born. That doctrine is called the Nullification Doctrine.
The Nullification Doctrine asserted that states be given the right and independence to nullify or reject a federal law. States could throw out federal laws if they thought they were unfair or just plain silly.
While the nullification doctrine never became a real law, it did stir up some pretty heavy debates between the federal and state governments about some pretty heavy issues.
The biggest issue brought to the table, and eventually the battlefield, was slavery. Slavery divided this young country both intellectually and geographically.
You see, there was a debate within the federal government about limiting slavery, yet many southern states wanted to make their own law for slavery. The lifeblood of most southern states was their crop-based commerce, and they relied heavily upon slave labor to keep the crop industry prosperous, and the last thing they wanted was restrictions on slavery.
Now, in order to understand how slavery figures into dual federalism, the nullification doctrine, and the Civil War, you need to look at the theories of one guy in particular, and that guy is Vice President John Calhoun. Calhoun served in office from 1825 to 1832, almost 3 decades before the start of the Civil War. Calhoun's ideals assert that if a state found a federal law to be oppressive to their independence, they could initiate its nullification. The southern states used Calhoun's concept of nullification to support their reasoning behind why restrictions on slavery should be thrown out.
When it became apparent that the federal government didn't really want to give up control over slavery limitations, the southern states then used Calhoun's arguments to support their further reasoning for separation from the Union.
So all the shaky time leading up to the Civil War was the first part of dual federalism.
But what happened when the smoke cleared and the Civil War was over? Well, first of all, Ken Burns started making a documentary commemorating the event. But not long after that, the second part of dual federalism began. It was during this period that the theme of separate powers continued to define federalism, as well as concurrent powers.
Post-Civil War dual federalism is marked by yet another change in Supreme Court leadership. President Lincoln appointed Salmon Chase as the new Chief Justice, and Chase's court, like the Taney Court, kept the growth of the federal government's power to a minimum. Consequently, most of the Chase Court's rulings resulted in increased state governmental power.
One of these historic rulings came out of the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case. In this case, a black man named Plessy challenged the Louisiana statute which outlined how railroads provide separate accommodations for blacks and whites. The case resulted in the court deciding that civil rights issues dealing with the rights of American citizens set forth in the Constitution, should be state matters, not federal matters.
Another concept Plessy versus Ferguson addressed was a specific civil rights issue. Could states provide separate yet equal public facilities for blacks and whites? Well, the court ruled that this was constitutional, meaning the act of segregation by states did not go against the civil rights contents of the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, a precedent was set, and until 1954, all civil rights issues would fall under the ominous umbrella of state power.
You see, the second part of dual federalism kept the same agenda as the first part. In the end, what came out of dual federalism was increased state power. But what, you might ask, ended the period of dual federalism?
Put simply, economic collapse. The Great Depression crash-landed onto the American scene in 1929. Between the Depression and the counteractions of the late great President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a new period of federalism was born.
The Great Depression lasted through the 1930s. Its beginnings marked the end of the dual federalism period and the beginning of the fourth stage in federalism's evolution. Cooperative federalism.
Cooperative federalism lasted about 3 decades, taking us through the poverty-laden 1930s and up to the flower-child-laden 1960s.
A nation in the depths of economic depression had elected its first Democratic chief executive in 12 years, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Cooperative federalism sprung out of President Roosevelt's reaction to the Great Depression. With the crash of the stock market, agricultural losses, and high unemployment rates, many Americans faced poverty.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Roosevelt formed a massive bundle of programs which, packaged together, were called the New Deal.
The New Deal was proclaimed a social revolution to lead the nation out of a Great Depression.
This New Deal was characterized by big-time federal government control of the economy and industry, as well as heightened cooperation among different levels of government. The New Deal relied on an influential national government to help the country clean up and get back on its feet after the economic collapse.
The key word here is cooperation. That's where cooperative federalism comes from. This stage saw increased cooperation between all 3 levels of government: federal, state, and local.
Cooperative federalism is sometimes compared to the structure of a marble cake.
Remember, dual federalism was considered similar to a layer cake, where the roles of each level of government are clearly defined. Well, in cooperative federalism, think of all the levels of government and their respective responsibilities being stirred up like different kinds of cake batter. You get a marble effect if you do this to a cake, and you get a similar effect if you do it to a government. The responsibilities and roles of each level of government become intertwined and interdependent.
So that's cooperative federalism. What followed this period was a particularly short stage in the history of federalism.
Stage 5 is called creative federalism. Based on our timeline, creative federalism came into fruition in the 1960s and lasted up until the 1970s. Short, but not so sweet.
Creative federalism owes much of its fame to President Lyndon B. Johnson, who served from 1963 to 1969. During his stint in office, President Johnson used government grant programs to alter the relationship between state and federal governments. States would become more reliant upon federal government for funding. This was called the Great Society. The result of his attempt to create a great society was increased federal control over the state governments.
This increase in federal power came from the distribution of federal grants. A grant is money that the federal government gives a state government for either a specific or undetermined purpose. There are two types of grants, block grants and categorical grants.
A block grant is given to a state to be used in a specific area of the government, such as transportation or education. However, the federal government does not require the state to use that money for a specific purpose within that area, such as road resurfacing or teacher training. The state has the freedom to choose how the money will be used within that specified area.
Yeehaw! Vermont's getting a new pair of shoes!
Categorical grants, on the other hand, are funds given to a state for a particular purpose. Unlike block grants, categorical grants do not allow a state to choose where it wishes to direct the funds. For example, if the federal government gives Kansas $10 million toward their state highway system, Kansas better not be thinking it's going to go out and hire 1,000 new teachers.
Grants ended up playing a big role in the increase of federal power. The federal government was able to restrict the states by controlling what kind of money it gave them. The federal government determined what the states should do by giving them grants that could only be spent in certain areas.
For example, if the federal government thought that money should be put into building more prisons, they'd offer money to the states via a categorical grant, specifically to build more prisons. It didn't matter that there might be plenty of prisons and that the state really needed more money for education. Nope, the agenda that the federal government set was the agenda that stuck, unless of course the state wanted to turn the money down. And heck, would you turn down money?
So what came next in the evolving world of federalism? Edible federalism? Portable federalism? Federal Express?
No. Try the sixth stage of federalism, New Federalism. New Federalism developed in between the leisure suit-clad 1970s and the web-surfing 1990s.
New federalism brought the whole state power theme back into style. After all that federal expansion during the periods of cooperative and creative federalism, it seemed like a good time to start paying attention to what the states wanted.
The federal government reasoned that states shouldn't be dependent on federally defined categorical grants.
President Richard Nixon got the ball rolling in 1968 when he proposed a method of funds distribution called revenue sharing. Revenue sharing is a method of redistributing federal money to the states. Revenue sharing does not attach money to a specific purpose like many grants did.
Revenue sharing lessened the control the federal government had over state issues.
The states would now be able to decide where the money was most needed, not the federal government. So categorical grants were out and revenue sharing was in.
Almost 2 decades later, President Ronald Reagan increased state autonomy even more when he reorganized categorical grants and structured them into more useful and less restrictive block grants. But when you add up the effect of revenue sharing and loose block grants, the outcome of new federalism wasn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of state power growth. Overall, federalism changed little during the period of new federalism.
Well, we've reached the present. Federalism is currently enjoying its most current stage in evolution.
Stage 7 is called competitive federalism. Competitive federalism began in the 1990s and is still kicking today.
But competitive federalism is based on an increase in competition between states and federal government for power. At the same time, it displays an increase in competition among states themselves for limited federal funds. But where's the competition coming from, and where do the funds go?
To answer these questions, let's take a look at federal mandates. Federal mandates force states to comply with certain laws. Since the late 80s and early 90s, the federal government has passed several federal mandates. For example, all states have to pass certain clean water standards. If states do not comply with this federal mandate, civil and criminal penalties may result.
Federal mandates require lots of states to spend big money. It costs serious cash to keep water clean.
So competitive federalism is all about the states saying, hey, big government, we don't really like the way you're running things. We think you're wasteful and bloated, and we're going to go off on our own and see what we can do with our own matters. And the federal government says, you don't like the way I run things. You don't like the way I run things. Then I dare you go off on your own, huh? Let's see if you can do it. And the states, they say, okay, that's exactly what we're going to do. And the federal government says, well, you know what? Then I don't want to see you showing up at my door at 5 a.m. in the morning with no place to stay and no food and asking for a cup of coffee because you're so tired. And then the states say, that's fine. And the federal government says, fine. Seriously, dude, just get off my back.
Because of economic growth, states aren't as bad off as they were in the early years of competitive federalism. The change from the hands-on years of cooperative and creative federalism to the hands-off years of competitive federalism wasn't as rough and tumble as people may have thought.
Let's review. There are 7 stages of federalism. The first one is called nationalization, and it lasted from about 1789 to 1830. In this stage, Chief Justice John Marshall set out to strengthen the federal government through the decisions the Supreme Court handed down. The second stage of federalism is called dual federalism, and it is split into 2 parts divided by the Civil War. Dual federalism Part 1 is defined by Supreme Court Chief Justice Robert B. Taney, who set out to increase state power by clearly defining the powers allotted to the states. After the Civil War, Dual Federalism Part 2 further increased state power through a series of Supreme Court decisions, including Plessy v. Ferguson, which declared that civil rights issues should be state, not federal, matters. The Great Depression of the 1930s marked the end of dual federalism and the beginning of cooperative federalism. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs to address the economic woes of the Depression led to the federal government working more closely with the states. In the 1960s, the 5th stage of federalism, creative federalism, began. In this stage, President Lyndon Baines Johnson increased the power of the federal government through the Federal Grant Program, which controlled how the states spent federal money. The 6th stage of federalism, New Federalism, lasted from around 1970 to 1990. President Nixon and later Reagan loosened the federal grant programs to allow the states to have greater control over how federal money was spent. And finally, the last stage of federalism, competitive federalism, began in the early 1990s and continues today. In this stage, competition is increased between federal and state governments over who's in charge. And that about sums up all the permutations of federalism for you.
Section D, the role of the Supreme Court in federalism.
The Supreme Court's influence on federalism is rooted in its influence over the division of power between the states and the federal government.
You see, many Supreme Court interpretations of federalism dealt with cases which affected personal rights and freedoms. These are things that floated back and forth between state and federal government control.
One such case which reached the Supreme Court resulted in increased civil liberties and rights and federal power to deliver these rights. In Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. The separate but equal accommodations for blacks and whites were not always delivering the equal in that equation.
Over the years, the federal government was known to pass many nationally imposed standards of conduct, including segregation laws, voting laws, labor laws, or other laws dealing with personal freedoms, thanks to the support of the Supreme Court.
However, even with this trend to increase federal control, not all Supreme Court cases necessarily called for expansion of powers at the federal level. Sometimes interpretations of the law favored states.
Basically, the Supreme Court's influence on federalism has to do with how powers divided between the states and the federal government. The Supreme Court pretty much decided who got what powers. Here, take a look at some of these power-related decisions.
The court placed the civil liberties issue of segregation into the federal government's hands. In the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, the Supreme Court gave the federal government the authority to order all state schools to desegregate their student population.
In 1966, another Supreme Court decision changed the state and electoral process. The court ruled against the existence of a state poll tax.
A poll tax used to be required for everyone who wished to vote. Those who couldn't afford this tax couldn't vote. But without the tax, well, invalidating this tax gave the national government increased control over many southern states that used poll taxes to keep blacks from voting. States were also forced to redraw geographic voting divisions. And in 1995, states were further restricted from adopting term limits for their representatives in Congress.
While these examples may give you the impression that the Supreme Court has been stripping states of their independence, that's not the whole story. In fact, a fair amount of power and responsibility has been placed in the hands of the states.
The Supreme Court ruled in favor of allowing states to determine their own reproductive rights laws, including abortion rules such as parental consent.
So all that said, the Supreme Court's been a heavy hitter through the evolution of federalism, making decisions every year that go on to further define the relationship between state and federal government powers.
Wait a sec. Before we wrap up federalism, take this with you.
The big idea to remember about federalism is power. Think of the government like it's a big teeter-totter of power. The states are on one side and the federal government is on the other. Over the years, the teeter-totter has been tipped back and forth. More power for the states, more power for the federal government.
And in the 90s, the teeter-totter beam has been tipping one way in particular. The Supreme Court and a Congress that favors less federal government intervention have been giving states back the power and independence they seek. And the states have been telling the federal government to get their hands off.
Hey, seriously, federal government, we really want you to get your hands off.
Why? I don't want to get my hands off. I like meddling into your business.
No, but we want to go out on our own right now. We want our independence. You know what I'm saying? I want the freedom to go out when I want to, and talk when I want to, and do whatever I want to.
I don't necessarily agree with that at all. In fact, I'm thinking that you're grounded.
You can't ground me, dude. Seriously, I'm on my own right now. I got some things going on, and I'm pretty sure that some cool stuff's going to be happening in the next few weeks. I'm going to be starting up a band.
Well, that's everything we have to say about federalism, but don't let it all fly out the window.
Part 5, Civil Liberties.
So far in our discussion of American government, we focused primarily on the relationship between the different levels of government. Specifically, we've covered the relationship between state and federal government in terms of power and responsibility.
But these different levels of government are really big intangible structures. Where do the people fit in? After all, Jefferson himself wrote in the Declaration of Independence that this was to be a government by the people and for the people.
Section A. What are civil liberties?
Okay, basically, civil liberties are all the things people like to do and think they have a right to do that government can't stop them from doing.
In other words, civil liberties are the personal rights and freedoms government cannot interfere with, either by law, the Constitution, or judicial procedure.
For example, if you want to publish your own free magazine, the government can't stop you. Unless, of course, the magazine contains a form of defamatory content. We'll get into defamation later.
A few other handy pocket-sized examples of civil liberties include the right to have a private life, the right to speak up when you're confused, the right to speak up when you're happy, the right to practice your religion of choice, and the right to have purple hair.
That was a brief description of civil liberties. It was also a very small section, but we're not done yet.
Section B, the Bill of Rights.
Now that you know what civil liberties are, you'll probably want to know where you can find them. Contrary to popular belief, civil liberties can no longer be found in your grocer's freezer, but they can be found in aisle 9. And they're on sale this week.
Civil liberties were once considered state territory. Back before the Constitution was written, states originally had civil liberty clauses in their individual constitutions. These clauses included stuff like freedom of speech, due process, freedom of religion, and so on.
Once the new Constitution was drafted and the federal government was given some control over the states started to wonder, would the federal government respect and honor the civil liberties in the state constitutions? After the whole England ordeal, nobody really wanted to take a chance.
So, the states submitted a stern request that before the Constitution could be ratified, it must include a bunch of civil liberties they wanted the federal government to recognize, like freedom of speech, religion, and the freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. In response, in 1789, Congress proposed to the states a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights included the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. These amendments guaranteed specific liberties the states wanted recognized, including the freedoms of speech, press, and religion. The Bill of Rights was finally ratified in 1791, just a few years after the Constitution was in 1788.
And so civil liberties were born. In this next section, we'll look a bit closer at two very popular civil liberties.
Section C, the Due Process Clause and the Incorporation Doctrine.
It's easy to see how the Bill of Rights affects where the federal government can step when it comes to civil liberties. But as the country grew and time ticked on, a new interpretation of the Bill of Rights formed. This new interpretation came in the form of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, added in 1868. Within this amendment was this clause.
No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This clause was called the Due Process Clause. The Due Process Clause clearly pointed out the need for states not to infringe on civil liberties. In order for the Bill of Rights to be guaranteed, states had to be as accountable as the federal government. Neither the states nor the federal government could get in the way of individual rights.
But it took years for the contents of the 14th Amendment to be strictly enforced. Eventually, states were required to guarantee those civil liberties that the federal government did, including the right to economic liberty, the right to protection from arbitrary governmental proceedings at any level of government, and the right to fair criminal procedures.
Now, along with the Due Process Clause came an essential doctrine, the Incorporation Doctrine.
The Incorporation Doctrine, which was drafted by the Supreme Court, states that most protections found within the Bill of Rights are applicable to states as well as the federal government.
Today, people call the concepts found within the Incorporation Doctrine selective incorporation.
You see, not everyone's civil liberties are necessarily protected in all states or in the country as a whole. Protection of civil liberties is selective. For example, many civil liberties protections are given to women and blacks, but the homosexual population is not always guaranteed those same protections. This is because many anti-discrimination laws cover race and gender, but not sexuality.
Before we get into the specific individual rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, let's quickly go over what we've already covered.
We first set out to define civil liberties. We said civil liberties are the personal rights and freedoms government cannot interfere with either by law, the Constitution, or judicial procedure.
We also said that many of today's civil liberties are found in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Subsequent amendments, such as the 14th Amendment, stated that states cannot infringe on civil liberties. The 14th Amendment outlined states' new obligation not to infringe on civil liberties with the Due Process Clause and Incorporation Doctrine.
Section D, First Amendment Guarantees.
Let's start where the authors of the Bill of Rights did with the civil liberties drawn up in the First Amendment, the freedom of religion, of speech, and of the press.
Congress shall make no laws respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Freedom of religion.
It's nice to have a historical perspective in your noggin when we're discussing religion's relationship to the American government system. Remember, religious persecution was one major factor that drove the colonists out of England and drove them further to rebel during the Revolutionary War. Therefore, America was founded on the assumptions that free religious beliefs and practice must be respected.
The colonists were pretty miffed, to say the least, when in 1774 the Church of England was made the official and only religion of the colonies. The colonists' anger for England's marrying of church and state comes out in the first clause of the Constitution.
Remember, it says,
Congress shall make no laws respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there.
Now, the first part of this amendment is known as the Establishment Clause. The second part, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, is known as the Freedom of Expression Clause.
She's not wearing a corset.
The Establishment Clause prohibits the federal government from establishing a national religion, which is what England did to the colonies in 1774.
The Free Expression Clause prohibits the government from interfering with religious practice, which is what the king did when he prohibited the practice of any religion other than his own church in England.
Today, many activities that would involve the marriage of government and church are prohibited. For example, school prayer in government-funded schools is not allowed. This is due to the Free Expression Clause.
Freedom of speech and press.
While the Freedom of Religion Clause stirs debate even today, it's the freedom of speech and press clauses that really grab the headlines.
The framers of the Constitution founded this country as a democracy, a form of government that relies on the free exchange of ideas for growth and change to occur.
However, the history of freedom of speech shows two interesting patterns.
First, freedom of thought has invariably been defended by both the framers of the Constitution and the government.
Freedom of thought has been defended because it's pretty hard to prosecute.
How do you know what someone's thinking, and why should anyone be punished for merely just thinking?
But it's the opposite for freedom of speech.
Our second point is that, unlike freedom of thought, the freedom of speech has been notoriously undefended and left to be stepped on and even persecuted. Well, not the actual liberty, but the people asserting it. Words, actions, and deeds have been subject to way more scrutiny than thought. When the courts get involved in this scrutiny, they need a way of determining exactly what words, actions, and deeds should be protected under the First Amendment and what exactly should be punished.
Since faced with that kind of job, judges have come up with several methods of determining which side of the fence a word, action, or deed doth fall. Each method applies to a different kind of speech, so the method applied to First Amendment cases will vary.
Take a look at the various methods for determining the acceptability of speech. There are 7 tests altogether, and we'll run through each one. If you're looking for a more detailed discussion, we suggest going to law school.
Test 1. Libelous, seditious, or slanderous speech.
Libelous words are basically false words, so a libel is a lie. But libelous words can come in 2 different formats. There's speech, which is the spoken word, and there's something that's written, which is the printed word, like in a newspaper. Another name for these 2 types of libelous words are libel and slander. Slander is spoken words considered libelous, and libel is written words considered libelous.
Seditious speech is a little more specific.
Seditious speech is when someone talks about overthrowing the government.
Test 2, the bad tendency test.
The bad tendency test is used to determine whether a speaker intended to have something bad happen as a result of what they said. For example, say you yell fire in a crowded movie theater that's not on fire, and half the audience is crushed by the other half.
Your speech is not protected by the First Amendment because you should know that something bad would happen as a result of what you said.
Test 3, clear and present danger test.
The clear and present danger test is used to determine whether speech should be banned because it poses a danger to society.
Gigantic Kezar Stadium holds the mass rally, where anti-war songs and speeches trigger a short scuffle between pro and con factions. No one was injured.
The clear and present danger test was used most often during wartime, especially World War II and the Vietnam War, to stop anti-war protesters from causing dissent within the masses.
Test 4. Direct incitement test.
The direct incitement test was established in 1969 during a case argued before the Supreme Court. The direct incitement test is used to determine which kinds of speech can be regulated by the government. The test says that if speech encourages and incites illegal acts, then it can be regulated.
So, it's okay to chant.
Make love, not war.
But if you were to chant something along the lines of, say...
Make war, often, in the vicinity of your congressman's house.
Yeah, that may incite an illegal act.
Test 5. Symbolic speech.
The 5th test, the test of symbolic speech, refers to the symbolism within America's methods of communication. Things like picketing, rallying, sit-ins, these are all symbols of the ideas that people are trying to convey, and these things are all protected under the First Amendment's Free Speech Clause.
Other such symbols include political cartoons, flags, and bumper stickers. However, some symbolic speech is highly controversial, such as the burning of the American flag or the displaying of a communist flag, even though these days both of these acts are legal.
Test 6. Prior restraint.
Prior restraint is the suppression of speech before the fact. You can't be stopped from saying something or printing something before you do it. You also can't be punished before you express your views.
In 1971, the United States government tried to suppress the publication of the infamous Pentagon Papers. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiff, the New York Times, saying basically that the government's attempt at stopping these Defense Department secrets from being published was a totally uncool abuse of power.
Test 7. Politically correct speech.
Our seventh and last test is the test of politically correct speech. This test of speech was cultivated more in college classrooms and places of employment than in the Supreme Court.
Politically correct speech, associated strongly with the PC movement, is the banning in private institutions of inappropriate derogatory speech, including racial, sexual, and religious slurs. One example of politically correct speech is associated with the sexual harassment rules found at many places of employment. These rules state that within the workplace, people are not allowed to make derogatory or sexually explicit remarks to others that may be construed as offensive in nature.
So, there are 7 tests to help guide both the court and the country in understanding where exactly the line of acceptable speech is drawn. There's libel, slander, and sedition, the bad tendency test, clear and present danger test, direct incitement test, symbolic speech, prior restraint, and politically correct speech.
But there's one more issue to ponder with regard to freedom of speech and of the press, and that's the issue of what is decent and what is not.
Well, it depends on who you are, where you are, and what you find socially valuable and morally corrupt. Basically, over the last century, as obscenity and pornography cases have flowed through the Supreme Court's docket, one thing remains clear. 9 Supreme Court justices are going to be hard-pressed to find out what America finds socially redeemable, artistic, disgusting, entertaining, or downright depraved. But every decade or so, they give it a try, and here are the decency results.
In the 1942 case, Champlinsky versus New Hampshire, the Supreme Court ruled that obscenity, lewdness, libel, and fighting words are not protected speech. 1957, the courts throw out an 1868 common law test of obscenity, and as a result, in Roth versus the United States, they decide that any material in question had to be devoid of any redeeming value to be considered unprotected and downright dirty. 1968, Richard Nixon runs for president and appoints a bunch of decent guys to the Supreme Court. These decent guys get busy attacking all that isn't decent. 1973, in Miller versus California, the Supreme Court put the decision of decent versus indecent into the hands of the states and, in turn, local communities. 1974, the court decides that Jack Nicholson is obscene in the movie Carnal Knowledge, and they weren't talking about his acting. 1991, the Supreme Court votes in favor of Indiana banning totally nude erotic dancing as it is deemed indecent.
So those are the highly important highlights from the Constitution's First Amendment. But remember, the Bill of Rights had 10 amendments, and we're not stopping here. It's time for...
Section E, the rights of those accused of a crime.
Okay, we've all seen our fair share of cop shows, and we've all watched our fair share of lawyer shows. This section will help you understand exactly what all those cop and judge characters were really talking about during prime time.
First off, what you may not know is where to find the rights of those accused of a crime in case of an emergency. But since we like to bring order to our viewers' lives, we'll tell you exactly where you can find those rights should you be accused of any criminal or unlawful activity.
The 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments of the Constitution cover the rights of all Americans facing criminal accusations before or during a criminal proceeding.
Before you get the details of these amendments, it's important to remember one thing.
You must keep in mind that individuals who are accused of a crime are innocent until proven guilty. People are not, I repeat, not guilty until proven innocent.
So with that in mind, it's easy to understand why the Constitution protects people from having their rights taken away from them before it's proven that they have committed a crime. Let's start by looking at the most basic rights of the accused. Due process rights.
Due process rights are a collection of procedural guarantees built into the process of a criminal procedure.
Due process is boring.
Boring or not, these are some pretty important nuts and bolts which hold a criminal procedure together and keep it from turning out biased or unfair decisions. So, Procedural guarantees basically allow for a defendant to get a fair trial.
Like we mentioned in the beginning of this section, several rights of the accused are located within the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments of the Constitution. These particular rights are also known as due process rights, and these due process rights are made up of procedural guarantees. Let's look at each of these amendments I just mentioned and the guarantees they hold. That way, the next time you get hauled into court, you can represent yourself.
Tonight on Real Stories from the Bill of Rights, Search and Seizure.
The Fourth Amendment provides protection against unreasonable search or seizure. The cops can't break into your house just because they think you've committed a crime. Police need reasonable evidence and something called a search warrant.
The Fifth Amendment provides protection against self-incrimination. Self-incrimination is the act of implicating yourself of committing a crime or illegal act. In other words, you can't be compelled to testify against yourself.
The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right of the defendant to the services of a lawyer and a speedy trial by an impartial jury.
The Eighth Amendment provides protection against cruel and unusual punishment.
Son, for stealing this apple, I'm sentencing you to eat your own weight in apples.
Hey, so those are some procedural guarantees. All together now. Procedural guarantees are also known as due process rights.
But of course, you've probably figured out by now that most everything that you find in the Constitution is up for interpretation. And what's more fun for a Supreme Court justice than interpreting rights?
Fishing. Definitely fishing.
Maybe. But during the off-season, there's a whole lot of gabbing down at the Supreme Court during case reviews. And some of the most heated debates